I gotta tell you that I feel like this is more than one conversation.
Good.
um, and I think, like, for one thing, we did not read the same book, so I think it's worth, figuring out as we go through.
You want to
Like,
do a swap now?
well, I don't know. I think one thing I've been thinking about is that I was making some notes about, like, how do you begin to tackle reading Twenge? And so
Yeah.
one of
Yes.
the things that I think is important is to know a bit about her kind of academic background
Yeah.
and the things that she has found interesting and worthy of study. And then I think it's important for us to look at, like, her kind of central philosophical anchors for doing this analysis.
Totally.
And so, I had, kind of listed out, there's the individualism versus collectivism thing. There's the idea of a slow life strategy that is born of, frankly, she calls them technology, but and it's not that it's not technology, but I think it's kind of a combination of, um, health outcomes and civil society expectations, right?
Right.
That create a slow life strategy, because you're going to live longer, so you can prolong your adolescence, et cetera, right? So there's that. She wants technology to be the third leg of the stool, but she's not deeply committed to that in her analysis.
I have the same feeling.
And instead, I think one of the things, like, going through generations and getting to the chapter on millennials, and it's like a book unto itself. I mean, honestly, I had not appreciated that this is a 500 plus page book. It's a tome.
Yeah.
But
It's a lot
when
of
you
it's
get,
a lot of twangy.
it's a lot of twain. And I had to, like, kind of switch to skimming with Gen Z, and I am kind of refusing to read the Gen Alpha section, and I don't even want to know what she thinks about the future. Like, I will come back to it, but I kind of got through Gen Z and was like, all right, enough. But and so I think, like, the individualism thing has a matched pair dynamic to it, which is that it's individualism, and that I think at some end of individualism for her is narcissism. And she wrote that
She
book
wrote a
about,
book. Yeah.
the narcissistic generation, or whatever it's called. And this is an area of study for her that I think is contestable. And so I think, like, there's that. And then I just think that there's a certain kind of, and so back to the part about the millennial chapter is so thick, is that that's her real area of interest. It's millennials. It's not
And
all the other generations.
yes, and that's where
Um,
she did most of the research.
right. And you can see it because, like, she does a handful, like, one or two interviews with real people in, like, the silent chapter and the boomer chapter, and then there's, like, hardly anybody quoted in the Gen X chapter, and, some data and stuff,
It's
and
typical
like, she's a
for
Gen
Gen X.
Xer, and
Yeah.
whatever. And so then we're back into millennials, and it's like, oh, we're quoting students and whatever, because she's not going to have Gen X students or boomer students at San Diego State. She's going to have millennial students.
Correct.
So, like, they're available to her, but that's also clearly what she's most interested in. And so there's a kind of, like, hand waviness about the prior generations that, like, conflate a bunch of things, rest on some easy stereotypes about those generations, are kind of weirdly incurious about those generations.
I don't
Um,
think you know what I've observed in iGen is that she puts a real focus on the window of that generation in her descriptions and analysis.
mhm.
And I have more critique of her takeaways, but for the other generations, she sort of describes them. It'll be iGen, then millennials, and then everyone else is sort of treated as one segment. Like Gen X, Boomers, Silents are all that 60 years of one group, which
Mhm.
you cannot subscribe to the idea that there is a difference between iGen and millennials and believe that the other three later ones are, or earlier ones are
Or
the
just
same.
all kind of a big wash. Yeah. Yes. And I think, in generations, she makes more of a concerted effort to, like, take each living generation, um, in their turn, though giving most of the bulk of the book to millennials, frankly. So I think there's that. And then there's just like the well, I think there's a kind of methodology thing to talk about, which is like her approach to assembling her argument is what I mean by methodology. So some of it is like what data sets she relies on, what diagnostic tools she relies on, but some of it is also just like the way she kind of wields it at you, of like, you may not question me because I have assembled a pile of reports, and that pile of reports represents an 11 million person data set. That is not really what she's working with. It's not an 11 million row database of answers to all these different questions.
Correct.
She's assembling different studies, and some of them are tiny clinical studies, and some of them are giant surveys, and some of them are longitudinal and conducted over decades, and some of them have only been in place since 1997 or whatever. Like, it's a lot of apples and oranges. It's a fruit basket. It's still all fruit. It's still all research. But it's like the way she talks about her methodology feels like it's defensive. It feels like it's there to say, you may not question me.
Yeah.
And then I think there's another part of that, which is how she then uses that data and frames it, because there's a fair amount of like, and look, this is just the way it is, but like there's a subjectivity to the way she uses the data that she doesn't want to acknowledge. And I think it's not even about her. I think it's actually about these kinds of books. And so I do want to kind of talk about these kinds of books. And that leads me to the last thing, which I want to talk about with her, which is why I don't think this is a one episode thing, which is the structures of the books themselves. And I have obviously experience with the Generations book. You've read iGen, but like, there is a structure to the book that makes it that I think is related to the question of methodology and how she uses data. Like, it's there to like the top line of it is, it's not a scientific method, right? The scientific method, you assert a hypothesis and then you test it to invalidate it.
Right.
That's the scientific process. People forget the part about how you're trying to disprove your hypothesis, not prove it. That's what validation means in this context. And like, I have this conversation with startup founders all the time when they're like, well, we want to validate our hypotheses. I was like, no, you want to see if we can invalidate your hypotheses.
Yeah, you're
that's what we want to do.
Case, actually, yeah.
Like, we want to put it through the ringer to see if it's true, not like assume it's true and look for evidence of that. And books like these, and I think like Haidt's books, Scott Galloway, whatever, they are very skilled at saying, I have an idea and I'm now going to go look for evidence that supports my idea. And oh, look at that, I found it. And then I think there's this other kind of meta discussion that I feel like we have to have, which is reading this, reading the polls for crosstabs, reading other things that I'm reading, because of course I'm in one of my 5 books at a time phases.
Oh God.
I do think there is a real problem with the way that the social web metastasized. I do think there is a real problem with internet connected mobile devices being the center of all of our lives.
Oh yeah.
I do think that there is more depression, anxiety, and suicidality kind of across the board since about 2014 that is kind of unfairly laid at the doorstep of mostly younger people under 40, even though she writes about how boomers are depressed, anxious, dying deaths of despair, and committing suicide more than their predecessor generations as well.
Yeah,
so
you
clearly,
could look at those deaths of despair as like a major indicator as opposed to suicide.
Exactly. And the only real difference...
Or along with, as a type of suicide.
Yes. And all of those things are also up among Gen X, just not as bad. But then again, they're coming off a lower baseline because Gen Xers were more depressed as teenagers. Mm-hmm. So like... So anyway, like I want to grant a whole lot of premises there of like, I think there is something wrong with the social web. I think there is something wrong about smartphones. I think there is something going on with people's sense of disconnect whether that is disappointment, as she terms it, or whether it's a sense of, frankly, betrayal or unfairness or having had the rug pulled out from under you, even though the objective data does not support that. Something is happening in the culture that is making, like, I was saying this just now to my husband, like, there is a disconnect between what millennials thought their adulthoods were going to be like and what they're like. But there is also a disconnect between what millennials' adulthoods are like and what they think they're like.
Yes.
Like, the experience of their adulthood doesn't match the on paper reality of their adulthood.
There's a third part of that triangle, which is there's a difference between what the rest of us thought millennials were going to make the world like and what the world is like. And so if you go and you read her books, if you read her kind of various theorem and you go back to Millennials Rising, which this iGen is like a direct descendant of Millennials Rising. It's like they're going to save the world. We've talked about that a lot. Then all of a sudden the car goes off the cliff.
Well, and so I will give her some credit here, because by the time she writes Generations, which came out in 21, 22, something like that, she, I think, is off the Howe and Strauss train. She references them consistently in the sense of, like, what they wrote was this, but that's not how it worked out. So I think,
and she does not go deep into the fourth turning, the generational turning theory as well in iGen.
Right.
She references
I think she's got a lot of skepticism about, like, the horoscopeness of the turning theory, right? Like, well, it's the age of Aquarius, so here we are. But like so fair enough. Kudos. I'll tip my hat to her on that one. But I do think, yes, there is a disconnect between what we all think young people are supposed to grow up to be like and what reality is. There's a disconnect between our expectations for them as agents of change and then how much we're really willing to allow them to be agents of change when we disagree with the type of change that they want. And then, of course, we don't give up our agency just because there's 23% of the population is under 40 or whatever. Like,
right. And you can take that to any corporation where the company wants to, we have to improve the culture, so let's hire these people that are different. And then you watch those people wither on the vine as they're not allowed. Well, that's a great idea, but this is how we do it here. Or, we couldn't do it because this person in this unit doesn't want to do it that way. Like, we're the same with generations of youth where we're like, the banking system is crushing you, but I kind of have all my money in it. So sorry.
Well, and I think also because, like, a tendency of the very young is to propose, frankly, abolition, tear it all down.
Yeah.
And that's obviously not really practical. It would be extremely destructive in the near term, and the near term is a generation. Like, it's not a couple years of pain, it's 30 years of pain. Like, you want to dismantle the extant banking system, knock yourself out, but plan it, because it's going to take a minute to get that done. And also, like, I don't know, I also have been reading I just finished reading a terrific novel that is also now a limited series on Apple TV. So if you want, you can do the shortcut version, which is just watch it. It's called The Gentleman in Moscow. And
who wrote the book?
His last name is Tolles.
I want you to know, I'm not going to read it, but I'd like to know.
It is I have to say, and Amor Tolles is the name of the author. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. It is absolutely delightful. I have not had as much fun with a character, spending time with a character in quite a while, I feel. But the premise of it, right, is you have a guy who was is Count Alexander Rostov. He was, an aristocrat, and then the Bolsheviks come in. We have the Russian Revolution, and he becomes a former person. Oh. And the solution to this, and part of the reason he becomes a former person, is he is believed to have written a like counter-revolutionary poem. And so his punishment, though, because they can't quite pin it on him, and because he didn't do anything else, like he didn't take up any guns or kill anybody or, really resist in any way. And in fact, he like was in Europe when it broke out and then came back to Russia. So they don't really quite know what to do with him. So they exile him to the place he is currently residing, which is the Metropole Hotel in Moscow. And he is not allowed to leave this building for any reason. And so he lives out the rest of his days, more or less, inside the Metropole Hotel. And but within it, the author occasionally will like provide a useful historical footnote that is in fact true about the way that the Russian Revolution kind of transpired at the turn of the century. And it includes this whole thing about basically like young, urban, educated Bolsheviks being sent out into rural areas and into Ukraine in particular, because it's the breadbasket of Europe, frankly, but in particular of what was then Russia. And they have, I forget the name for the people who were like the landowners, the kind of, think of them in the context of, American agriculture. These are like the plantation owners.
Mm-hmm.
And so like these are the people who actually are administering these farms and able to manage them in a way to make them productive. They have a lot of tenant farmers living on the property and tilling the soil and picking the crops and all of that sort of thing. But they don't know how to manage farming at scale. But the communists are like, no, we're going to feed the nation, and we're going to do it with peasant farmers who don't know how to farm at scale. And the way we're going to prod them into productivity is we're going to send these college-educated Bolsheviks from the cities out into the countryside to enlist them in the cause of communism. And they will feel so inspired by our carpetbagging community organizers that they will get on board and produce enough wheat. And what happens instead is a fucking famine.
Yeah. Pretty predictable.
Right. It's just like every time it's that kind of like, it's so predictable. And it's also like, I don't know, in the current moment with the press being wrapped around the axle of a couple thousand people protesting on a dozen college campuses.
Totally.
It feels like we're extremely worried about those college kids that get sent by the party out into Ukraine to say, come on, guys, farm faster.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was thinking like you could substitute McKinsey for the Bolsheviks in any corporation. Don't you think?
That's better, yes.
The company is not optimal. Send in the consultants, and the consultants come in and they're like the Bobs, and they have great ideas. They're great ideas. They're ideas they heard from the people that they met with who are already at the company that's failing.
You're right.
It's a recipe for success. We have a framework that'll fix this.
That's a better comparison. It is. It's just like it's just the kind of like weird faith that like the young and the ideological will transform everything for the better, and it's like, no.
I mean, they do that. They do it incrementally. Yes. Every year, things get incrementally improved, whether you want to believe it or not. That's what's happening. Our lives today are better.
Yes.
But the promise of 5-year-olds, Generation Alphas, is this is the generation that's going to solve every single thing, and they're going to do it because they have access to, they're the iPad native generation.
Yes. And so I think we're back to kind of two things, which is you have this fourth turning theory of generations that Howe and Strauss really kind of infect the social sciences with in thinking about generations. Mm-hmm. And so, by the structure of the four turnings, the millennials are going to be the next greatest generation. Gen Z is going to be the next silent generation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're going to follow the same kind of patterns of behavior and social structures and everything else. And then it sort of winds up not working out like that, right? And I always go back to the line from Millennials Rising about like, unless something catastrophic happens, They're going to be the next greatest generation. If something bad happens, they're going to rise up and overthrow the existing order.
Right.
Now, something bad has happened multiple times since millennials came of age. And I think actually that like the kind of expected cataclysm never works out the way you think it does. And again, I'll go back to thinking about the Russian Revolution, which took like 100 years to start and then finish. And it's arguable that it's not over yet. In fact, I know that he's not making episodes anymore, but I am going to put in the show notes a link to the Revolutions podcast because it's so excellent.
I think things seem pretty solid there. The president just won his 19th straight term. So I think everything's resolved.
I think it's
Seems
okay.
Great.
Yeah, but in particular, I think like the thing that a lot of these kind of pop sociologists, pop psychologists wind up doing is thinking that change happens in the scale of the lifetime of a single generation.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't. Like if you go back and listen to the Revolution season about the English Revolution and you really listen to it, there is no argument that they are having in the 17th century in England about the way men should govern themselves from what we are arguing about right now.
Yeah, it hasn't been resolved. Yeah.
We have not resolved the question about whether it is a good idea to let people govern themselves and let everyone in on that project, or to let only a few people govern themselves. We have not stopped having that argument fundamentally. The Russian Revolution is completely different. The Russian Revolution is like, do we let kings govern us, or do we let a party that acts like a despotic monarch?
Do we decentralize the king into 10 wealthy people?
Yeah. Well, yeah, then it turns into that. But like, and it is sort of this, turn to collectivism, but a very selective collectivism. Only a few people are active in the collective, right? Like everybody doesn't get a say. The peasants are still peasants. We can't possibly trust them to be part of this conversation. Anyway, the point being, like, these are centuries long fights.
Farrah, we are 30 minutes into our Twenge episode. We have not talked about Jean Twenge.
It's just like, I don't know. Okay.
So why don't we do this? Why don't we continue on this wild thread we're on? Because you've brought up a couple points that we need to flesh out, maybe as a precursor to Twenge and hate.
Well, I think that we could talk about, I think the things that I think we can get to today that are about Twenge is about the pillars of her argument by the time she gets to the book Generations. Because I think she's coalescing a whole bunch of things that she's thought about and studied and made arguments about and then seen them work out or not. And the reason I bring up this kind of, the geologic time of politics is like the way that they all get so disappointed so quickly, right? That we all get so disappointed so quickly. Like, why don't I have radical change right now is kind of actually like the central question of the political moment we're living in. Is like, the latest New York Times Siena swing state poll has this question in it about people wanting change and to what degree they want change, and people would like serious structural change. And some of those people are like, if a dictator is what it takes to get me serious structural change, I'll take it. And, then there's everybody else who's like, actually, I want a president who will return things to normal. So like, how do you square these circles? But the frustration about feeling stagnant or feeling like things backslide or feeling like a group of people did not live up to my expectations is so present in these books. Like, there is like a fundamental sense of like, I assumed that I should be optimistic about the youth, and now I'm not. I'm actually pretty pessimistic about the youth. Yeah. And I'm coming up with reasons why they are disappointing me.
So you're getting right to the crux of something I was just reading before we jumped on here, which is a wonderful website called jeantwenge.com. And it's her website. And on her website, because I am in a ethical gray area because I work at a university and she is a doctor at another university. She is much more accomplished than I am. So I want to tread very carefully about her experience and credentials and all that stuff. But I can read what words she puts out and critique those pretty reasonably. So if you go to the homepage of her site, what I was trying to figure out is, as I read iGen, I was like, well, this does not read like a scholarly publication. And in fact, it is not one. She has published like 180 papers. Mm-hmm. Amazing. Mm-hmm. No denying her background. But when you go to the website, Dr. Jean Twenge is available for speaking events as the headline. When you read the description, Dr. Twenge's talks have delighted and enlightened audiences across many fields. She has helped investors, executives, parents, marketers, mental health professionals, and I'm cutting out the descriptions of what she did for them. She gets to all those things before she says college faculty and K-12 teachers. My point is...
And the military.
And the military, yeah. And when you look at the organization of her, just like, this is a very basic UX test I do in competitive marketing analysis. Just look at the order of the links in the header. Mm-hmm. Home, books, writing, speaking, media. There's nothing. Research is sixth. Mm-hmm. Like, she has transitioned from the platform of researching professor, primary investigator. I'm sure she still does that and plays a role in her life. But she is into the persona part. She's in like, oh, the Scott Galloway part. I can be a personality that, Fox News or CNN will have on to talk about the issues when it concerns the youths. And when I read iGen, that's what it feels like. It feels like an airport book when what I thought I was picking up, kind of in the same way Millennials Rising. You're like, but where's the meat?
Yeah.
And you just keep getting more and more high level, shade.
Yes. So I think the thing I started to think about, because we've talked about this with other people, is like, we talked about this with Millennials Rising. Like, where did these guys come from? Are they demographers? Are they sociologists? And the answer was no on both counts, right? So neither of them were these things. The the difference with some of these academics is, she's a psychologist. Haidt is also a psychologist, though he teaches in a business school. The thing about these backgrounds is you do, I think, expect them to be a bit more scholarly based on primary research. I mean, whatever your opinions of Brene Brown is, and her team are primary researchers conducting mostly qualitative research, interviewing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people.
And it seems like she is more responsible about citing research more clearly, her own research or third party or secondary research. Yeah. That she is referencing, like, in a way that you can access it.
Yes. And one of the things about airport books is, they don't have, footnotes on every page. They don't necessarily even have endnotes. Like, there may be some sort of index of resources at the back. I haven't flicked to the back because I'm reading it on a Kindle, so I'm sure there's a whole big like appendix of stuff in there. And she does, in the opening chapter of Generations, list out the primary sources, but there's a lot of inconsistency with how data is cited throughout the book. Like, sometimes when she really wants you to take it seriously, she will say this is from the census's community survey, or this is from the Harvard Youth Poll, or this is from whatever, right?
This book is almost all pulled from Monitoring the Future.
Interesting. And so, like, she will do that, and then she will do other things where no footnote, no specificity. A study found X, and it's like, a study of what, by whom, about what, what was the design, what was the sample size, like all of those things. Are just
I'm a doctor.
Yeah, exactly. It's don't worry, I'm a doctor. The other thing, though, is just to, and so maybe the place to start actually is the structure of books like these, because I don't even want to say that this is like a specific to Jean Twenge problem. It's a problem of these ideas books that are like grounded, at least ostensibly, in social science, and yet are written to be lay books. They're
Right.
not written to be for the profession or for academia.
Yeah.
And the, so maybe there's like a mismatch of expectations here, that like I'm reading it as a researcher wanting to know what the research is. Other people are like, interesting ideas. There's that. The other part of it, though, is the like, I don't know. There are some of these things that I just feel like are research I would expect. No offense, listeners, but I expect like brand planners at agencies to do. It's like the Google Scholar, the Google Books Ngram search of like the prevalence of a particular word or phrase.
Yeah.
And it's like,
I totally know what you mean. There are times where she goes extremely deep on a subject that obviously she has knowledge about. And then there are other times where she just sort of says, like, as we all know,
yes,
iGen be lazy. Like,
so my favorite one, once you get into the millennials section, because it's where the narcissism narrative becomes dominant. The previous generations, boomers and Gen Xers, they're individualistic, but not narcissistic. The millennials, they're narcissistic. And I'll come back to narcissism and the narcissistic personality
no,
index.
we can jump into it now, because that's an extremely important part if we're just doing the UX analysis of who is this person and what is their point of view. Her second book, I mean, I think there are elements of it in her second book, but her third book is called The Narcissism Epidemic.
Yes.
Living in the Age of Entitlement. And it presents a clear point of view about who is a narcissist. And by the way, it's anyone younger.
Yes. Well, so the interesting, there are a lot of interesting things about the narcissism thing. One of the things I just want to address is the way she proves it. Right. So some of it is based on, and now I'm going to forget what this thing is called, but it's like a standardized tool that's been around since like the late 50s for assessing narcissistic traits. The first thing to say is there is a difference between people having narcissistic traits and people having narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah.
So the battery of questions is not large. It's like 10 statements or something. And really what they are is 5 statements and they're opposites. And I think it's on a, like a, I don't know, it's on a scale. I think it's like a 30-point thing. And so, or I might actually be confusing this now with the racial resentment scale. But anyway, this scale, if you pick the narcissistic statements and also, so this is the thing, I don't even know how to unpack the whole thing because she makes it so convoluted. One of her pieces of evidence that millennials are narcissistic is that they are raised in a period of time where the use of the phrase self-esteem is peaking, where phrases "I love me" apparently appear in a handful of books and had never appeared in any books prior to them appearing in a handful of books. This is another one of the things that drives me nuts about books like these, and that's the way data is presented in charts. Because the scale is never 0 to 1 or 0 to 100. It's always like 0 to whatever the top number is. And then we shade things where we think it's convenient and ignore the shape of the graph before or after the shaded areas.
So that it's 400% more, and that means 4.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And that happens a lot in the book. The interesting thing about narcissism is that for it to be essentially a self-destructive version of narcissism, because there are versions of what are called narcissistic traits that are not negative, that, you know, are correlated with leadership traits, are correlated with happiness. The thing about it is, do you have the narcissistic characteristics and high or normal self-esteem, or do you have the narcissistic characteristics and low self-esteem? Because true narcissists, when we start talking about it as a disorder, these people do not have high self-esteem. The reason it's called narcissism is that their entire sense of self-worth is reflected back to them by other people's adoration of them. And when they don't get adoration, they become agitated, destructive, abusive, all of those kinds of things. Not because their self-esteems are so big, you know, are so high, but because they're so low. Because without that validation, they are no one.
And what you just described is the way we described the millennial generation as a whole. We told them for 15 years they're going to be so great and pumped them up. And then we pulled the rug out and said, they suck. They're killing everything. It's like.
But the interesting thing is, she sees in her analysis high self-esteem as narcissistic.
Yeah.
Which, to my reading of the paper, that I have spent way more time reading about narcissism than I thought I was going to when I started reading this book, like, that's not my understanding of how of a destructive version of narcissism. Yeah. So like, she may find it personally distasteful as a Gen Xer that millennials spend a lot of time thinking about their self-esteem, but like, it's not clear that that's bad. In fact, she even, you know, stipulates that people with high self-esteems tend to be happier and more well-adjusted. So like, you know, it's very hard for me to unpack, like, is she talking about narcissism in a pejorative way or in a neutral way? I can't always tell. She definitely wants to talk about it. She definitely wants to hang it around the shoulders of the millennial generation as like they are uniquely narcissistic. And then like, it doesn't quite work out that way, because they still turn out to be depressed, anxious, more deaths of despair, more suicidality by the time they get into adulthood.
Yeah.
They're happy as teenagers, not happy as adults. Something happens in between there. And her sort of central anchors for understanding why that might happen is like, well, that narcissism came back to bite them in the ass. And also individualism bad. And they're the most individualistic of all the generations thus far until we get to Gen Z. They're even more individualistic. They're so individualistic, they don't want to be forced to pick a gender. Oh my God. Like...
Wait till you meet Generation Beta.
Oh my God. And then she has a weird name for Gen Alpha too, but my brain refuses to store it.
Oh yeah. Well, she tries to rename all the generations. I think she tries to like put a brand on them. So Generation Y, Generation Z, I guess, is iGen.
I think they're iGen. Yes.
Yeah. But she tried to call millennials Generation Y, I thought.
Yeah, I can't remember what she wanted to call them.
I think she did. And then when she lost that one, she was like, I'll get in early with Generation Z and change it again.
Yes. And that one was she has a great line in the book in Generations about the naming thing, where clearly this has become like an irritation to her, and she has to say something a little bit snide about like, Gen Z is derivative and blah 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 blah.
Yes. Yeah. That's in iGen too. She's like, this is why I don't like these names. They're the same thing. I bet it's verbatim.
It's probably.
I think I slacked you about it because it's kind of petty, but I'm also on board. I'm here for it because I think it's hilarious that
it's like, really funny.
I'm getting really a peek behind the curtain.
It's yes. The narcissism thing, though, I was like, what? So what made her interested in narcissism? And the other thing I did was chase down some interviews with Twenge, and I will say this: I should probably actually look at like her media appearances. Things that she lists major media at the top, but like, she is someone who, you know, Bill Maher, the Wall Street Journal, what's his name? Jordan Peterson.
I couldn't.
A variety. I'm like blanking on some of the people. Oh, Megan Daum, who talks about cancel culture. the kind of intellectual dark web folks love them some Jean Twenge, but not solely them, right? Like, when we talked to Kim Parker, she said they consulted with Jean Twenge when they made the decision to move away from generational analysis. And, she is interviewed by major media outlets. But when you anyway, so you find yourself watching the first 7 minutes of a Jordan Peterson video, and I just want to say, like, there's nothing weirder than a Jordan Peterson video.
Yeah.
Like, he sets himself up in a chair in a log cabin with a bunch of chopped wood behind him, and he's like 20 feet away from the camera, so you can see all of him.
Yeah.
And then he seems to ask his guests who are not with him in person to effectively do the same thing. So Twenge is also like 10 feet away from the camera, sitting on a barstool height chair in front of a bunch of windows overlooking, I don't know, San Diego or something. And like, it's surreal and bizarre, and like someone's going for TV production values, but this is not how TV works either.
Right.
like
Yeah.
Chris Hayes may be 15 feet from the camera, but that camera is zoomed the way the hell in on his face, and the set is kind of right behind him, and whoever he's talking to in the DC bureau is in a little booth with like the camera right in front of them and a backdrop right behind them. Like, this is not what TV looks like. It's very strange aesthetically. But setting all of that aside, you get her to talk about like the first real piece of research she did, which, and I think this is one of the things to say about how a lot of academic social science gets done, which is not primary research. Like, I think it's just really important to talk about, like, there's not a lot of budget. There's not a lot of grant money sloshing around.
No, a lot of it is building on prior studies, combining different findings, using data to sort and sift and get to approximated conclusions that will hopefully earn a grant to do the next study.
Right. And in particular, when you're writing your dissertation for your PhD, as a graduate student, unless you are attached to a lab that is well funded, you are not doing primary research. You're going to do I have a friend who finally got her PhD in psychology. She'd been working as a psychologist for a long time, was a licensed clinical social worker. And her doctoral thesis was built on 15 interviews plus secondary research into publicly available databases.
That's what iGen is.
Yes. Well, it's what Generations is as well. And it's like, I have to tell you, just as a quick aside on this, I feel like someone needs to come along and give me my 45 PhDs. Because
for the number of interviews you've done and reports you've put together.
I literally don't know how many hundreds of people I have interviewed in 20 years about a variety of topics. And any given project, I don't talk to fewer than a dozen people.
Right.
And I do all this desk research, and I do all this stakeholder research, and I do a survey. Like, give me my PhD. Somebody.
You could probably get one. If you Google, did I earn a PhD? I bet we could find one for you.
Someone's just going to print out a certificate and send it to me. But like, so I think it's important just to ground normies in like what goes in to, and I don't want to say, because I also know the pain and suffering of writing a doctoral dissertation. It's not easy to do it, but it's not grounded in loads and loads and loads of primary research. It is grounded in what you can afford to do with the time that you have and the budget that you have available to you. And a lot of it is looking at publicly available, or at least academically available, data sources. There's a lot of stuff I would love to have access to, and I have to ask you to get it for me because you have a .edu address and I do not. Every time that it's like, log in through your institution, I'm like, my institution is Adam. I wish I kind of kept my credentials with Parsons, because I used to be able to log in through these things through my new school address.
It's extremely nice to not hit a roadblock when I'm researching something that I'm just curious about. And I'm like, oh,
yeah,
here's a treasure trove of white papers on this. Yeah.
Why is this information locked up? But so, when she did her first big project as a PhD candidate, she looked at I cannot remember the name of the scale now, but it is something I actually have experienced. So it was a scale that was, again, sort of a questionnaire, and the I can't remember if the questionnaire itself is like a just which of these statements do you agree with, or whether it was a Likert scale for each statement and how much did you agree with it or whatever. But it gets scored. And when you score it, you get an assessment of how masculine or feminine you are according to these personality characteristics. So the first thing we have to acknowledge is there is no way that that scale is cross-cultural and like works everywhere in the exact same way. We also have to acknowledge that longitudinally, it probably doesn't make a ton of sense because cultures evolve and gender roles evolve with it.
Oh yeah, you
And the
tried to
reason
do
that
that
I
over the
have,
last 30 years, your mind would be blown.
yeah. And so I remember in ninth grade health class, we took this thing as a quiz. And myself and the ninth grade boy who had already had the big growth spurt and was already like 6'2", you know, and 170 pounds, was like, we were the two most masculine people in the class. And I remember this because there was, you know, much hilarity in
in some way that tracks for you.
Yes, it absolutely does.
I just watched you bulldog your way across this book. I'm like, yeah, this makes sense. Yeah, it sounds. I mean, that's a very what would be considered a masculine approach.
Yeah, I'm not giving anybody the benefit of the doubt. You're gonna have to prove it.
Yeah.
So, so anyway, so she looks at the scores on this from like whenever the scale is first devised in like the 50s or something through the early 90s when she's in graduate school.
Yeah.
And she sees that women's masculinity scores are going up. Separately, she also sees that women's anxiety scores are going up. And she's like, wonder what's going on there. And you can see the seeds of a thesis about narcissism in that work, right? Which is like, you are overestimating your abilities, capacity, capabilities. You are inflating your strength. You are inflating your assertiveness. You are inflating all of these things outside the bounds of femininity, and it's making you anxious.
Yeah.
And like, from there, you can see the leap into narcissism. And like, that to me was super illuminating. That, and then, you know, she, you know, one of her favorite things is to find one of these standardized, accepted scoring systems, essentially these indexes. So it's like, I think it's called the Narcissistic Personality Index or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so she finds that one and sees those scores increasing over time. Now, the interesting thing is she wrote that book with someone else. He has since said that he sees narcissism scores declining since 2007 or 8. And his theory is like, well, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. And 2008 punched a lot of people in the face. And things have, like, even if the economy has recovered, the culture hasn't. And so, like, the sense that everything's up and to the right never really came back.
Right.
And so, except for very few people. But, like, she kind of maintains that, like, no, narcissism is here to stay and it's only getting worse. And that is a thing she feels relatively entrenched in. Her co-author has backed off it a bit. She doesn't seem to have, or at the very least, she doesn't want to come out and say that she has. And then in the meantime, there have been some investigations of the tool itself that basically say, just like the masculine feminine index, this index doesn't account for social change. Like in the 50s, kids were not taught self-esteem. They were taught seen and not heard.
Right.
They were they were still in the spoil the, you know, what is it? Spare the rod, spoil the child kind of a period. Like corporal punishment was still prevalent in schools up until like they weren't really banned until the early 90s. Like it was mostly gone, but not entirely gone. And like I grew up in Oregon, it was gone from Oregon, but it was still being debated in other states when I was in elementary school and middle school.
Goddamn liberals.
Why can't we beat the hell out of these kids? Tough them up. But the, you know, so these statements don't mean a lot after a while. And the other thing that they are, when you actually like dig into the history of them, is kind of made up. Like,
well, yeah,
they're not deeply theorized. it's like, well, what do I think a narcissist is like? Well, I think they think these things about themselves. So I'll ask them these questions. And if they say, yeah, everyone loves to hear my stories, then I'll call you a narcissist. And it's like, I don't know, like maybe you're a narcissist, maybe you're just a really good storyteller and you're aware of the fact that you get a lot of laughs. Like, are all comedians narcissists? Probably. But like
That's an
but
interesting
only
point.
because
That is a good closed sample to do a research study on. That's a population you could actually control for.
did you
But you can't
watch
do a broad societal
no
study that's longitudinal because
no
it's just too big. Like the same thing with
yes.
generations. Did I watch what?
Well, I'll come back. The thing that you just made me think about, though, is so she and her research partner did that look at the data and concluded that narcissism was increasing amongst young people. And then someone else did a fairly large scale study across 4 or 5 universities in California, I want to say. And they looked at that data across time and instead found that there was no real change in narcissism. And then that got challenged by Twenge and Campbell, I think is his last name, who wrote the book, the narcissism book with her.
Yeah, Keith.
Um, and they challenged it because apparently, for whatever reason, students at UC Davis are not very narcissistic. And there was a period of the study where they were only collecting data at UC Davis. And so it's a UC Davis effect. Now, I just want to quickly say, if you can find that there's a whole group of people at a fairly large school in the UC system that aren't narcissistic, then maybe narcissism isn't what you think it is. Because
You
like,
can't
I
just say like, well, those 3 years we're just going to throw them out because
we're just going to throw them out.
Validate our theory.
There's some sort of sample bias here. The kids who go to UC Davis, not narcissists. You can't rely on that data. Excuse the sample. You need a more representative sample that includes whatever.
The group I want in there.
The group I want, exactly.
This comes down to Haidt does the same thing in his defense of the anxious generation or whatever his cell phone book is, which is, hey, here's my idea. I came to the book with the idea before I started researching. I've had this idea for 20 years. Trust me, there's a lot of research. I collected it on my website. Mm-hmm. And I've listened to a dozen interviews with him because I'm like, I just want to hear how consistent he is with debate. And the debate he gets is somewhat soft in a lot of cases. People ask him one tough question and then retreat, but he doesn't really get a thorough debate. But what he keeps saying, go to my website, all the links to all the research are there. And for me, the listener, oh, okay, you're a doctor. Like, I believe you. That's good enough for me. And me, the podcaster, goes to the links and starts reading them. And I'm like, well, not really. I mean, and also it's not quite as comprehensive as he makes it sound. It's a dozen studies.
Yes.
But then when you look at them, you're like, well, this doesn't really say that. This suggests the potential of what he's saying.
Right. It's a lot of correlation. And like, look, this is a kind of real challenge of social science in general, is that we have indexes and tools and diagnostics and methods that are long-standing. They've been used for a really long time. And they correlate with some particular kind of outcome we're also trying to predict. And so because that correlates, it's good enough, right? It has fairly consistent results, so it's reliable and replicable. It continues to be correlated with a particular outcome or a particular other characteristic that we can measure with some other standardized method.
Mm-hmm.
But when you dig into the history of these methods, most of them wildly under-theorized, most of them made up out of whole cloth by, frankly, white guys in academia in the 1950s and 1960s, and have not been updated to reflect social changes.
Yeah, but
you cannot have like an objective measure of narcissism or individualism or any of these things because they are relative to the cultures that they're within.
Right, and but even failing that,
arguing cultural relativism.
Let's say you could. Yeah. It has come full circle. Even if you could have a longitudinal study of narcissism that was absolute, and we all said, yes, that's true, you can't, it's not like the back of a mixer where you're just taking the plugs and putting them into different inputs and outputs and mixing and matching the research studies and saying like, well, look at this. These are similar lines that are going in the same direction, so they must be related. And I think we probably have to reserve like the hard look at the real content of her books for the next episode. But as I'm reading iGen, as I was taking notes and as I was circling things, I'm like, it seems like there should be more question marks in it than periods. I would be able to tolerate it more. And the same thing with hate. And this, to a certain extent, like Galloway too. Galloway is so emphatic. And that's what makes him entertaining as a personality. But as like an ideas person, I say, man, I just wish you would have a what if on some of these statements that you're making. And I bet Jean Twenge thinks this way, but the way she presents it is very absolute. Yeah. And that makes me dig in and say, like, what the hell are you talking about? Now I have to go look at the numbers and track this down because this doesn't compute. And I think there's a way to present these ideas as equally compelling, but not like I did an interview with someone, and so therefore here's what the entire generation is like.
Yeah. And I do want to credit her with a couple of things. And one is, and this is more like how the book is structured and written problem, but like she will set up with the kind of thing that is now for us received wisdom about what each of the generations are. Yeah. And then she will trouble that narrative a little bit. You know, there are limits to how much she wants to trouble it. And limits in where she's looking for evidence that does allow you to trouble it. But she does question some of these things. Like in particular, she does a lot of questioning of assumptions about Gen X. And it may be because she is Gen X. There are also, there's a lot of questioning about, as we have done, a lot of the assumptions about how economically sound millennials really are. And that there's the narrative about it, and then there's the reality of it. And then we have a problem about the gap between the reality and the perception. But she does do some of that asking questions. She does propose, like, here are some possible explanations for why this thing is happening in culture. Yeah. And so can we find any evidence for each of those possible explanations? But when you look at the explanations she selects, they seem to come from the pundit class. They don't seem to come from academics or from clinicians or people who are actually studying these other people. And so it's like, well, why are, Gen Z and millennials more depressed? Is it because they're all Democrats and Trump won in 2016? And it's like, well, no, they were depressed before that. And it's like, really? Someone thinks that's the explanation for anxiety, deaths of despair, and suicidality in millennials as they approach middle age? Trump won. That's it. Like, give me a break.
Yeah. Their candidate that they were so passionate about, Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. Right. So anyway, so I think I agree with you. I think she has thought deeply about these things. I think when she sits down to assemble the arguments, I think maybe what's happening here is she's imagining a lay audience who reads a lot of op-eds in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and what they're bringing with them as the arguments. Yeah. And so she's going to reckon with those as opposed to really trying to get into root causes of things.
And maybe, maybe if she stuck to op-ed length, like maybe she's a great blogger and in 650 words. Yeah. But when you get to 44,000 words, it starts to become, you're stretching it out and and part of it is, I think, her aspiration to be a media personality. And I don't think she quite gets to pundit territory, but she does want to be a go-to resource. Yes. That's clear. She wants to speak. She wants to consult. And amen, man. Go get that paper. Like, do it. But it shapes the way she presents the information and that conclusion part of each of the chapters where it's like, and so therefore, all iGen are this. It's like, well, wait. You didn't prove that. You didn't assert that until just now. And it's an anecdote that you're using, not the monitoring the future data that is cited. Doesn't really back that up.
Yeah. There are a lot of limits to how applicable, how widely applicable any of the identified traits of the generations that she has identified are. Like they are, for one thing, like they may be time boxed, like they're true right now for a specific group of people and won't be true later. I mean, even one of the things I'm, in the Gen Z section of generations where she's talking about, I don't know, it looks like this generation, unlike Silence, aren't that they're supposed to be like, according to Howe and Strauss, they're not going to have any kids at all. They're never going to get married. And I'm like, or in your slow life strategy theory, there's going to be a baby boom amongst Gen Zers when they hit 30, 35. Like, and she also, by the way, is the proponent of the theory that like actually there isn't a fertility cliff at 35.
I know. And we're seeing that year, that threshold. We've talked about it before, that it's been advancing and advancing and advancing. So in that sense, her theory is correct. Her slow life theory is, in some ways, I agree with some parts of it and I reject other parts of it. But like, I don't think that's why we're holding on to adolescence.
No.
But I do think that's why we're having kids later.
Yes. And so, but it's very, she goes back and forth between being skeptical, credulous, prognosticating. And I think it's because she is trying to operate in the punditry as opposed to operate in the academic side. And so like, and the academic work obviously informs the punditry, but like these books, and so again, I'm going to just sort of suspend disbelief here on how much of this is like a Twenge problem and how much of it is a book publishing industry problem. That's like,
there's that too. There's a media issue of how the thing gets converted from her mind and fingers through an editor, through like, we got to sell this in airports, so therefore.
And there's a real desire in generations to structurally treat each of the generations symmetrically. So every generation gets the same sort of structural treatment of like, here's a broad definition, here's a list of names, here's some sort of historical interlude that affected this generation in a particular kind of a way, forgetting that everyone went through it, and then like then it's her list of traits that she's identified for the generation. And occasionally she stops to interrogate those traits. Like, why are those traits that way? Can we come up with some reasons why? But she doesn't really start doing that until you get to millennials. That's clearly her area of focus. And so I think like that systematizing of the way the chapters get written, probably makes it very writable. I do read it and think like, oh, okay, so that's how you write a book. But the other thing about it is that I think it creates enough structure for the lay reader to feel the structure is so consistent that is how I know it's rigorous.
Right.
And I also want to say, like, I don't want to say that it isn't rigorous. I think she did do a lot of research to write these books. I just think there's a selectivity to it that is very like, I have a theory and I'm going to look for evidence of my theory.
Yeah.
And my favorite example of this is she has a paragraph about millennials and their narcissism. And it cites 3 songs that were, she claims, popular and are emblematic of this narcissism. And one of them is a Weezer song. And I can't remember which song it is now, of course, but she quotes the line from the song after saying in parentheses, apparently without irony. And right there I shut down, because if you're going to say apparently without irony and a song by Weezer, then I think she's not that familiar with Weezer. Weezer is an irony band.
Yes. Yeah, irony core.
She got right that Blind Melon was a minor key band. That's correct. She did not get right that Weezer would do something apparently without irony.
She referred to them as a minor key band?
Yes. And I mean, that's fair. They do a lot of minor key stuff. But then she cites 2 other songs.
What a weird thing for her to know.
Well, I think
that's a pretty deep, like, musical knowledge.
Yeah. But again, like, it's a very Gen X thing to know. And it's also like, that's how you know we were depressed as teenagers, was all that minor key music.
Minor key, diminutives.
And so she's got that. And then she's got a song that like charted at 14 in the UK, which means it didn't even make it onto Top of the Pops. And that was it. And, you know, fine song, but like that particular act, it was a duo, male female duo, like never charted again. Only ever
Nice.
put out, I think, 3 albums. And
So
then the
you're
other
not. So you're
example,
saying they're not exactly a powerhouse of driving culture.
I'm saying not a lot of people would know this song. Like, this is not emblematic of anything. Nobody heard this song. There
It
was
didn't
one
even
song.
make like a Nick Hornby book.
Right. Like when Rob Harvilla eventually does 60 songs that explains the aughts, this song will not be in it. And like
60 songs that explain the UK.
They explain the UK. And then she has another one where it did chart. A lot of people know this song, mostly because Bruno Mars was on it. And the problem with it is it makes a reference to becoming a billionaire. It's a hip hop song. And like a lot of hip hop songs do that.
Oh,
and
I
so
know.
like now
like
you're
a lack
talking
of
about hip hop
cultural-
culture. You're not
Yeah.
talking about narcissism.
Totally.
And this guy's personal story is not a story of narcissism. It's a story of addiction and recovery and making a name for himself and building something. Like this is not necessarily a narcissism story.
And you have to be
but the
aware.
keywords work.
Yeah. So a thing I've started doing, and I'm glad you agree, we're going to do another episode because we have to get to the meat of the books, which
Yes.
an hour and 15, and we have not touched them really.
No.
And
I got to go because I'm already late. But yeah.
Oh shit. Okay, we'll finish up. But just to give you a teaser for next time, I've started reading some of her research writing.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yes.
Because in research writing, she is the opposite. She is thorough. She is buttoned up. She does close the loop. She does cite. So I think it is crossing the threshold from the academy to the bookstore. And to a certain extent, I respect that. I get it.
Yeah.
Like the difference between art and commerce, or the difference between research and commerce. You got to account for it, but it's confusing if you're going to put the PhD initials after your name in the author. I come with a certain level of skepticism and critique that's earned.
Yes. And I think the risk then is because it's an airport book, an ideas book. If you want to understand generations, you got to read this book for journalists and marketers and employers and whatever, that they're not going to go read her academic work. They're going to read this. And they're not going to necessarily understand the terms as she is using them in this book. Like one of the things that I find confounding throughout the book is the use of the word individualism, because she clearly has a specific meaning for it. And it's never like in one place in some sort of upfront glossary of terms. When I say individualism, I mean this, because that her use of it is not my colloquial understanding of it.
Our next conversation is going to be a big look at
gotta talk about individualism
versus collectivism, because it's a theme in iGen as well, and I think it only expands in generations.
All right, well then that's our plan. We're going to talk about individualism. You're going to rep her good work, and then I'm going to quibble about how she constantly describes boomers in one particular way.
Can't wait.
All right. Adam.
Good to
I'm
talk
gonna go
to
get a
you.
massage.
Do it.
All right.
You've earned it.
Thank you. I'll talk to you later.
See ya. In the Demo is written and hosted by Farrah, Bostic, and Adam Pierno, with support from the Difference Engine. Edited by Allison Preisinger and AMP Studio, with production support from Ashley Darrington. Music used with permission by Omega Man under the Creative Commons license. Go to inthedemopodcast.com for behind-the-scenes research, supporting information, and transcripts. If you'd like to support the show, please rate, review, and share the show with people you think will appreciate it. Thanks for listening.